When people talk about skateboarding, you often hear them using the word flow. The meaning this word has for skateboarding is related to a really interesting concept in psychology, also called flow. So today we're going to talk about skateboarding games and the psychology of flow. Before we get to the concept of flow, let's talk about skateboarding games a bit. I was writing a video for the channel called The Most Important Video Games Ever. Keep an eye out for that in the future. And in that video, I'll talk a little bit about the Tony Hawk's games. Thinking about them got me remembering just how much I love skateboarding games and how popular those games were. I think the Tony Hawk's franchise includes some of the video games I've played the most of in my life, especially Pro Skater 3 and Underground. Underground being the best in the franchise for me and one of my favourite games ever made. I was also playing a lot of the skate games at some point, and there were these other two games called Street Skater 1 and 2 that I was playing as well. I've been into skateboarding games for as long as I care to remember. But I realised that I hadn't actually had a good one in my roster for a while, so I picked up a wonderful game called Session Skate Sim the other day, which is one of the most realistic and difficult skateboarding games ever made. And I've been rediscovering their peculiar brand of joy. There's a very particular pleasure to be found in skateboarding games. Booting up a session, cruising around, doing tricks, exploring the environment and discovering new ways to interact with the objects in it, figuring out new tricks, new combinations, new things to do, setting challenges for yourself. It's easy to lose hours in one without ever even leaving a particular area. They're also, in a way, really relaxing and comforting experiences. A good way to kind of turn your brain off and chill out for a while. They can be frustrating at times when you're trying to execute something and you can't, or you're trying to complete a really difficult mission, but through practice you get better and better, and the feeling of finally pulling off the thing that you've been trying to do for the past hour is just phenomenal. But aside from being just good gaming experiences, skateboarding games are culturally significant. The Tony Hawk series is one of video gaming's most successful franchises, one of the best-selling of the early 21st century. Though the series would later fall into disrepute with the release of the god-awful Pro Skater 5, the early games, from Pro Skater 1 through 4 to the Underground games and American Wasteland, represent some of the most beloved games in the history of gaming. These games didn't just resonate with skaters, as the developers thought they might. They blew up to become a genuine cultural phenomenon. The series as a whole is estimated to have sold 1.4 billion copies. The latest entry in the franchise was a remaster of the first two games. Within 10 days, it had sold 1 million copies, becoming the fastest selling Tony Hawk's game ever, 21 years after the first one came out. If that isn't proof that people love the franchise, I don't know what is. It's hard to overestimate the impact these games have had on the gaming industry and skateboarding culture. The release of the first two Pro Skater games in 1999 and 2000 played a huge role in the cultural ascendancy of skateboarding. As a sport, as a fashion, the music, the soundtracks have become iconic in and of themselves. Several bands and songs I've come to love I heard for the first time in Tony Hawk's games. The Dead Kennedys, the Ramones, Rage Against the Machine, Bad Religion, Stiff Little Fingers, The Explosion, Social Distortion, the Dropkick Murphys. And people still love the old games, even if new ones and remasters of the old ones have come out. There's a fan-made mod called Thug Pro, which uses Underground 2's engine as its basis, and includes almost every level from all the original games in the franchise, which is like 63 levels or something. So if you want to play the old Tony Hawk's games, this is almost certainly the best way to do it now. You can log in and play almost any level from any of the older games, but with the more modernised gameplay technology and features of Underground 2. But of course, the Tony Hawk's games aren't the only skateboarding games ever, and they're not the only way to make a skateboarding game. The Tony Hawk's games are super accessible, easy for anyone to pick up and play, have a very arcadey feel to them, where you're racking up ridiculously high scores of hundreds of thousands of points and chaining dozens of crazy, often physically impossible tricks together. As a result, while they might be some of the most engaging, fun and successful sports games ever made, they're super unrealistic. They give something of the feel of skateboarding, the most idealised fantasy of it, but they're nothing like actual skateboarding. The physics, for instance, are absolutely insane. In a Tony Hawk's game, as long as you can maintain balance, you can grind seemingly forever on any surface without losing any momentum. In reality, you'd only be able to do this for a few seconds at most. You can jump off the top of buildings, land on the ground and roll away like nothing happened. One of the most iconic moments in the series comes from Tony Hawk's Underground, the first game in the series to include a genuine narrative. And this game uses a moment like this as an important moment in the story. At one point, your character uses a ramp on top of a hotel to jump over a helicopter, do a flip, fall several stories, and stick the landing like a madman. Needless to say, that ain't happening in real life. Not all modern skating games go the way of Tony Hawk's. The series started to wane in popularity and critical success around the time of the lackluster Project 8 and Proving Ground, which ditched the narrative and humour of the previous 3 games that had gone down really well with players, and replaced it with what I thought was a really boring and regressive take on the franchise, a massive step back after the ambition and fun of the previous 3 games. The series which stepped up to fill the void here was Skate, a much more realistic take on a skateboarding game, with much more realistic physics and a completely different control system. In the Tony Hawk's games, you performed an ollie by holding down and releasing the X button on PlayStation, and performed tricks by pressing the requisite buttons while in the air. You'd grind rails by ollieing in the general vicinity of one, and pressing triangle, at which point your player would automatically latch onto the rail. In Skate, you performed tricks by flicking the direction sticks in the right direction, and to grind a rail there was no magical input, you actually had to land on it. There was less of an emphasis on putting together crazy combos, and more on performing particular tricks and combinations, most of which might actually make sense in reality. While there was a story in the Skate games, it was minimal, just framing the gameplay, which was focused towards giving players rich environments to creatively explore in a way that represented skateboarding largely more realistically, some crazy glitches and bugs aside. It also included this great thing called Hall of Meat, which tracked the bones you broke, and even included challenges where you had to break certain bones or get a certain number of points in Hall of Meat by injuring yourself as much as possible. The Skate series went on a hiatus after Skate 3, but a new entry has been in development and is scheduled for an early access release in 2025. However, in Skate's absence, this trend of more realistic skateboarding games continued, with Skater XL and Session being the 2 most significant successors to Skate. I can't speak too much to Skater XL, but from what I can gather, it's not a bad game, but it's somewhat lacking in content, and many players of Skater XL have migrated to Session because it's received constant updates, fixes, and additional areas through DLC content. Session is also generally thought to be more realistic than Skater XL, and perhaps more realistic than any other skateboarding game ever. Like Skate, it also features a system where you trick by flicking the directional sticks on your controller, but this time each stick controls a foot, so you ollie by flicking down on one and forward on the other, which mirrors how an ollie actually works in real life. If that sounds confusing, that's because it is, but you do get used to it. Skating games sometimes get criticised for being too floaty, meaning that when you jump, the player stays in the air for way longer than they should. Session feels really snappy in this regard though. When you jump, you come straight back down again, as would be the case in reality. And to do specific tricks, you have to pull off quite complicated, precise movements on the controller. And to grind, you have to land the board perfectly on the thing you wanted to grind. I'm really impressed with Session. I'd recommend it to anyone who's missing Skate and wants a realistic representation of skating. So we've seen 2 of the most dominant approaches to making skateboarding games. The cartoonish arcade stylings of Tony Hawk's and the more realistic inclinations of Skate and Session. Both in their own way are captivating, and both are successful to varying degrees. While nowhere near as successful as Tony Hawk's, which sold 1.4 billion in total, the Skate games still sold millions. Skater XL has reportedly sold 578,000 copies, and session 431,000. So there's clearly an appetite for skateboarding games. But why is that? I'd suggest that it's got something to do with a word you hear often when people talk about skateboarding: flow. In skateboarding, this term has at least two meanings. One is flow sponsorship, which is when a skater gets a low-level, unpaid sponsorship from a skating shop or brand, which gives them free gear, a bit of representation and exposure, and some opportunities, but no money. The type of flow we are interested in was conceptualized by the Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Now, I hope I'm saying that right, but I almost am certainly not saying that right. Now, while many people might not know that Csikszentmihalyi came up with the concept of flow, his concept of flow and a flow state have become fairly widely known in pop culture. Flow, as he thought of the term, is a psychological state of hyper-focus, optimal performance and enjoyment, colloquially referred to as being in the zone. Csikszentmihalyi spent a large portion of his career writing about flow, but two of the most important books he produced on it, which are a good starting point for this, are called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, and Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, The Experience of Play in Work and Games. The idea of flow was the centerpiece of a 2010 study on skateboarding by a pair of scholars called Seifert and Hedison, published in the Journal of Happiness Studies, called Intrinsic Motivation and Flow in Skateboarding, an ethnographic study. In this study, they interviewed skateboarders, asking them about what it's like when they're in the zone, when they're skateboarding. Let's hear some of what they had to say, which I think highlights well what psychologists mean when they talk about the experience of flow and a flow state. It's a natural high. It's addictive. The feelings you get from skateboarding are addictive. I feel like I'm unstoppable, like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders and I'm under no pressure whatsoever. I feel free. It's like you're flying around the park on your skateboard. You feel like nothing can ever stop you, and the skateboard is just part of your body. You feel like you have so much power and control. You feel like you're such a good skateboarder. It's hard to describe, but it's almost like you're so completely wrapped up in what you're doing that your mind shuts itself off from anything else. When you're in the zone, you're in a different place, a place where nothing else matters. It's a place where you feel on top of the world. You feel like you're in another world or place or something like that because you don't care who or what is around you. In the zone is like you're in a different world altogether. It's not like you were in this world at all. You're so carried away with the skateboarding. This is all really in line with how Csikszentmihalyi thought of flow. He characterized it as a state in which a person is completely, intensely occupied with and enjoying an activity. A state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. And as a holistic sensation that people feel when they act with total involvement. In a flow state, a person's experience of time is transformed, and other needs such as food, water, and sleep are often disregarded. Like a flowing river, the person proceeds unimpeded, continuously, operating at peak performance, their movements fluid, precise, controlled, their minds focused, blocking out the rest of the world and their everyday concerns. We can achieve flow in many different situations. We can get it from our favourite hobbies, from work, from cooking, and other types of activities which require active engagement, skill, and focus, and which are capable of being enjoyed. Flow is described by Csikszentmihalyi as being so enjoyable, exciting, absorbing, and rewarding that human beings seek it out for its own sake. He thought flow was key to human happiness. Flow is something with an intrinsic motivation. It's worth pursuing and experiencing purely for its own sake. Many people would describe skateboarding, playing video games, or whatever their favourite hobby is in these terms. They do it just because they like doing it, and that's the only reason they need. For Csikszentmihalyi, what makes these experiences so enjoyable and what makes people seek them out is that they put people into flow states. And flow states make us happy and enrich our lives. Being happy requires having a good dose of flow in your life. The type of psychology he was doing in his work on flow is sometimes called positive psychology, meaning psychology that studies optimal human flourishing and optimal human performance. A lot of people might associate psychology and psychoanalysis with what's called psychopathology, meaning the study of mental illness and what happens when human psychology goes wrong and fails to function optimally, like when we get depressed. Positive psychology is almost like an opposite to psychopathology. It studies what happens when the human psyche is functioning well, at the best level it can function at, and how best to bring about the optimal functioning of the human psyche. This is why an article about flow and skateboarding can be published in a journal of happiness studies. Flow is sometimes thought of as being an integral component to human happiness. Skateboarding games try and simulate the sensation that those skateboarders were talking about. When you're deep in concentration, completely absorbed in that thing, functioning at your highest level, feeling invincible, pulling off trick after trick, and flowing seemingly effortlessly between them. As they also say in the study, it's what every skateboarder aims for. This is what games like Session simulate really well, I think. Because you really do have to work hard to get good at them and learn the mechanics and controls and so on. Being successful in them really does make you feel something like those skaters describe. Pulling off even one particular move in Session can feel like an achievement. So when you really get in the zone and pull off several in a row, flawlessly, feeling good, looking good, linking them together, you do feel kind of invincible, and like you're capable of doing whatever the hell you want. Then you bail in the stupidest way imaginable, and you have to get back to where you were, because there you were flowing. That's the specific type of skateboarding flow games like Session try to portray. But the general activity of playing games is capable of putting us into flow states. They can be so enjoyable that the hours fly by without you noticing, and you don't attend to your hunger or thirst or sleep, because that would mean you have to stop doing this thing you're enjoying so much and performing so well at. Whether this is killing zombies, managing a fortress, playing a different sport, video games offer a hugely diverse array of experiences and potential for flow states. Flow can obviously have downsides because these experiences can get addictive and disruptive if you do them too much. But well-managed flow states are some of the most exciting psychological states there are, and we encounter them often when we're playing video games. Thank you so much for watching. Do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this about philosophy and video games and everything in between. This has been Breaking the Game, and we'll see you next time.